When King Robert Baratheon ascended to the throne, the Seven Kingdoms were at a tipping point. The crown had been won through rebellion, but the realm was not yet united. There were rival factions, power struggles, and the ever-present threat of the old houses, who still whispered of rebellion. Yet Robert's reign began with hope and the promise of a better future for the people. But what if Robert had made a different decision, one that would alter the course of Westeros forever? What if Robert Baratheon had chosen Tywin Lannister as his hand of the king instead of Eddard Stark? Tywin Lannister, the head of House Lannister, was a man of great ambition, political cunning, and unyielding authority. Known for his ruthless efficiency, Tywin had earned a reputation as one of the most powerful men in Westeros. But instead of offering Ned Stark the role of Hand, a man with noble honor and loyalty to the realm, Robert chose to place Tywin in that position. The consequences of such a decision would have been profound and perhaps even catastrophic for the kingdom. Tywin's influence would have immediately reshaped the political landscape of King's Landing. With his sharp intellect and ruthless strategies, Tywin would have quickly dominated the small council, pushing aside the less influential members and securing his own power. Under his rule, the Lannisters would have strengthened their hold on the Iron Throne, with Tywin using his wealth and military might to further cement House Lannister's position. Robert Baratheon, already a man who had lost his enthusiasm for the throne, would have likely fallen into the background even further. Tywin would have ruled with an iron fist, making decisions that ensured his family's prosperity and position. The notion of a loyal, honorable hand, like Ned Stark, would have been a distant dream under Tywin's reign. However, there would also be tensions. The decision to make Tywin Hand of the King would have alienated key figures in Westeros, especially the North. Ned Stark was respected not just for his honor, but for his integrity. The North, loyal to House Stark, would have found it difficult to accept the political maneuvering and corruption that came with Tywin's rise to power. The alliance between the Lannisters and the Starks would have been strained beyond repair. One can only imagine how the relationship between the Lannisters and the Starks would have unfolded had Tywin been at the helm. Tywin's cold, calculating nature would have likely driven the two houses further apart, even if it meant war. The Stark loyalists in the North would not have stood idly by while House Lannister attempted to seize control. Tywin's dealings would have led to a much quicker escalation of tensions within the realm. His power grabs would have been more overt, and he would have likely taken a more aggressive stance toward the Tyrells, Martells, and Targaryens, using every resource at his disposal to eliminate any threat to his rule. Tywin's approach to diplomacy was always rooted in the idea that power should be obtained by any means necessary. Alliances were made for strategic purposes, not friendship. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon, whose lack of interest in ruling was well known, would have become a figurehead in his own court. His drinking, his infidelity, and his apathy toward the realm would have likely increased as Tywin's power grew. The king might have found himself even more disconnected from the day-to-day workings of the kingdom, with Tywin making the crucial decisions in his place. But Tywin's leadership would have been tested in ways that no one could have predicted. The threat of Daenerys Targaryen, the last surviving Targaryen, would have loomed large in the background. Tywin would have had to address the growing power of the Targaryens in Essos, all while managing the political intricacies of the Westerosi nobility. His diplomatic acumen would have been put to the test as he balanced his ambitions with the looming danger from across the narrow sea. Tywin's rise to power would have triggered a massive shift in the power dynamics of Westeros. His relationship with House Baratheon would have been strained to its breaking point. Robert, already exhausted from years of war and ruling, would have faced increasing pressure from Tywin's unyielding political ambitions. While Tywin was a master of strategy, Robert was a warrior king who had won his throne through strength, not subtlety. Their partnership would have been fraught with tension, with Tywin's pragmatic, often cold approach contrasting with Robert's impulsive, reckless nature. As the political structure of the realm shifted under Tywin's influence, other houses would have begun to question their loyalties. The Tyrells, who had initially supported Robert's claim to the throne, would have been drawn into the web of Lannister power. Tywin's cunning would have tempted them with promises of greater influence, and it is likely that House Tyrell would have aligned more closely with the Lannisters in this alternate timeline. Their alliance would have given Tywin even greater strength in the political game, further cementing his grip on the throne. However, the Targaryens were a different matter altogether. In this version of events, the presence of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons would have played an even larger role in the politics of Westeros. Tywin's cold, calculating nature might have led him to underestimate the power of Daenerys. Instead of focusing solely on internal power struggles, he would have likely dismissed her as a threat in the early days of her rise, a mistake that could have cost him dearly in the long run. Meanwhile, Jon Snow, who in this timeline would not have been legitimized by Ned Stark, might have remained a figure outside the main conflict. His loyalty to House Stark, though still strong, would have been tested as Tywin's growing influence overshadowed the North. The Stark legacy, which once seemed so secure under Ned's hand, would have crumbled as Tywin sought to consolidate power over the entire kingdom. This might have led to the eventual downfall of House Stark as a major political force in Westeros, with their land and titles slowly being chipped away by Tywin's manipulations. The wars that followed Tywin's ascent would have been brutal, with Tywin making calculated moves to destabilize his enemies, wiping out those who stood against him. His methods would have been ruthless. Poisonings, betrayals, and backstabbing were all part of his playbook. The realm would have been thrown into chaos as the Lannisters' rise to power was met with fierce resistance from those who still believed in the traditional values of honor and loyalty. Jon Snow's role in this timeline would be one of resilience and survival. The North, fractured and weakened by Tywin's influence, might have seen Jon rise to prominence as a figurehead of Stark loyalty. His path would be one of sacrifice, as he would have to fight against Tywin's growing empire to restore the honor of his house. The struggle between the Lannisters and the Starks would have been far more intense, with Jon Snow standing as the last hope of House Stark's survival. In the end, Tywin's rule as Hand of the King would have been defined by his uncompromising will and unyielding pursuit of power. But as history often teaches, absolute power often leads to downfall. Tywin Lannister's ambition might have ensured his family's reign for a time, but it would have also set the stage for the collapse of his dynasty. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and other key figures would have been the forces that would ultimately bring down the house Tywin had worked so hard to build. Tywin Lannister's appointment as Hand of the King would have ignited a political firestorm in Westeros. While Tywin's strategic brilliance was undeniable, his ruthless ambition and calculated nature would have alienated many of the realm's houses. What began as an opportunity for Tywin to solidify the Lannister family's grip on the throne would soon become a bitter struggle for power, with numerous factions positioning themselves for dominance in the wake of his rule. The first significant shift would have occurred in the relationship between House Lannister and House Baratheon. Robert Baratheon, a king known for his recklessness and lack of interest in governance, would have quickly become a passive figurehead, with Tywin taking the reins of power. Tywin, ever the pragmatic strategist, would have respected Robert's power, but the king's lack of leadership would have only made Tywin more dominant. While Robert had sought to rely on the wisdom of trusted advisors like Ned Stark, he would now find himself unable to compete with the sheer force of Tywin's intellect and authority. Under Tywin's guidance, the small council would have been transformed. Gone would be the days of Ned Stark's careful moral deliberation. Tywin's leadership was founded on ruthless efficiency and self-interest, and he would have quickly solidified his control over the council, pushing aside those who did not align with his vision. In this alternative, timeline, the Lannisters would have been in complete control of the realm's financial, military, and political structures, making them an unstoppable force. The North, however, would have been the first to feel the backlash. The stark contrast between Tywin's cold, calculating approach to power and Ned Stark's honor-driven decisions would have caused a deep rift between the two houses. House Stark, already wary of the Lannisters, would have felt the full weight of Tywin's ambition. Ned's departure from King's Landing, a move he made out of a sense of moral duty, would have been viewed as a betrayal by Tywin, who had no patience for moralistic leaders who put honor before power. Without Ned Stark as a counterbalance, Tywin would have moved quickly to assert his dominance over the North. The Boltons, still a threat to the North's stability, would have been used by Tywin as pawns in a larger political game. With the North in turmoil, Tywin would have seen the strategic value of allying with the most powerful houses in the region, regardless of their moral standing. His ambition would have led him to consider alliances with the most unsavory characters, causing the already unstable political landscape to become even more chaotic. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen's rise would have been met with indifference at first, but Tywin, always aware of potential threats to his power, would have eventually turned his attention to her. As the last remaining Targaryen, Daenerys would have been seen as a dangerous rival to Tywin's ambitions, and he would have begun to focus his attention on quashing her rise to power. Instead of the subtle manipulation and diplomacy that Ned Stark might have employed, Tywin would have opted for a far more aggressive approach. The political machinations between the two would have been tense, and the rivalry between Tywin and Daenerys would have escalated as she grew in strength, aided by her dragons and newfound allies in Essos. In this world, Tywin's rule would have been marked by brutality and a constant fight to secure the throne for House Lannister. His political alliances, made purely out of necessity and ambition, would have kept the realm in a state of constant tension. The South would have remained a battleground of rival houses vying for power, while Tywin manipulated the shifting alliances to maintain his control. For Jon Snow, the North would have become even more fractured in this timeline. Tywin Lannister's rise to power would have pushed Jon further away from the center of Westerosi politics. In this version of events, Jon's loyalty to his Stark heritage would have driven him to oppose the Lannisters at every turn, and his role in the North would have been one of resistance rather than one of leadership. His eventual rise to prominence under a regime dominated by Tywin's manipulations would have been a long and difficult struggle. The Stark's legacy in the North would have been severely diminished as Tywin's policies weakened the house's hold over the region. In this world where Tywin Lannister held the reins of power, the moral compass of Westeros would have been lost. The realm would have become a kingdom of ruthless pragmatism, where alliances were made based on political necessity, and honor was a distant memory. Tywin's iron-fisted rule would have left the people of Westeros disillusioned, unable to trust their leaders, and constantly caught in the shifting tides of power. The wars that followed Tywin's rise would have been fierce and unrelenting. His enemies would have been many, but Tywin's calculated military tactics would have ensured that House Lannister remained the dominant force in the Seven Kingdoms. Yet his victories would have come at a cost. By sacrificing honor, family, and loyalty, Tywin would have alienated many who could have been valuable allies in his pursuit of power. The question of whether Jon Snow would have played a larger role in this alternate timeline remains one of speculation. Would he have found himself leading the North in a war against Tywin's Lannister forces? Or would he have been pushed to the fringes, a lone wolf struggling against a system designed to crush any hope of rebellion? In this new world order, the Starks would have been fractured, the Lannisters ascendant, and the people of Westeros would have lived under the oppressive rule of a king who would stop at nothing to secure his legacy. Tywin Lannister's ambition would have pushed Westeros into an era of constant strife, and the cost of his rise would have been felt for generations to come.